it was just an ordinary academic event, and there were students there. And so I gave a paper and some talks there. And after, in a break, one of the students came to me, and I think he had a Eluveitie T-shirt.
Yes.
He said, I heard you wrote Slania song, and I said, yes. Oh, thank you.
Yes, I can imagine
that was pretty cool. So.
Mes amis, bien le bonjour. J'espère que cette petite anecdote que je vous ai laissée en guise d'intro vous a mis l'eau à la bouche. Si vous avez vu ma dernière vidéo sur Eluveitie, vous savez que j'ai interviewé David Stifter, professeur de vieil irlandais à l'université de Meynooth en Irlande, et auteur de 3 chansons d'Eluveitie, pour lui poser des questions sur la langue gauloise. Dans la vidéo, j'ai mis qu'un seul extrait, mais j'ai trouvé l'ensemble tellement passionnant, je me suis dit que ce serait vraiment trop dommage de ne pas vous la partager. Alors la voilà.
So, well, the Gaulish language is a Celtic language. A Celtic language that is attested in antiquity, mainly in what is today France, but is also much wider spread in Europe. And well, it died out about 1,500 years ago, but it is documented for about 600 years in the Roman Empire, during the Roman Empire. And as a Celtic language, it is related, not very closely related, but somehow related to other modern Celtic languages, like, for instance, Irish or Welsh or Breton, or in the antiquity, for instance, with Celtiberian. Actually, the question is much more complicated than that. When we talk about Gaulish, the Gaulish language, the Gauls, and specifically people in France, think first of all of what is today France. But in fact, as historical linguists, we know that what we call the Gaulish language was spoken about a much wider area, from basically what is today France, but going into the east, Switzerland, southern Germany, most of Austria, probably also Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and even further down into the Balkans. Probably not as densely populated as maybe in France, but still. And of course, there is even pockets of Gaulish speakers in what is today Turkey. So it's really a very vast area that was covered by the Gaulish language. However, it is only for Gaul, that is roughly speaking modern day France, that we have very good documentation of the language. So most of the texts in Gaulish are from what is today France. That is actually a very complicated, very difficult question that we cannot really answer. Well, we are certain that Gaulish or variants of Gaulish were spoken in that much wider region in Europe. But outside of France, most of the documentation, most of the evidence that we have for the language is just personal names on, let's say, Roman gravestones, or place names that are recorded by Romans or that still live on until today. And they look very much the same like in France. There's hardly any difference there. So it looks as if it's the same language. On the other hand, this is very unrealistic as a scenario. If you have a language spoken about over such a wide area, there has to be regional variation. So there must have been very fine differences between the various regions, dialects, whatever. Unfortunately, we hardly know anything about it. And even in France, where we have much better documentation, we can see that there is some kind of difference between maybe the southern part and the northern part. The other thing of where we clearly see a lot of differentiation is across time. So the earliest evidence, the earliest written texts from Gaulish, we have from roughly 200 BC. And we know that the language was spoken up until at least the end of the 4th century AD. So that's 600 years at least, documented history. And over the time, the language definitely did change a lot. And we can see that actually in the text. texts. So there is language change going on, and that towards the end, it comes very strongly under influence from Latin, and it makes developments together with Vulgar Latin. So that's certainly various variants of Gaulish that can be seen, even though we only know fragments. First of all, that idea that the Gauls or the Celts in general preferred oral transmission, didn't like writing. That's an absolute misunderstanding, and that's certainly something that we as students or as researchers in Gaulish strongly disagree with. This is based on a misunderstanding in a passage in Julius Caesar's Gaulish War, where he talks about the Druids. And he says in that famous passage in the 6th book in the Gaulish Wars, Caesar says that the Druids do not like to commit their teachings to writing. Okay, and people usually stop at that point in the sentence and take it as evidence that the Gauls didn't use writing. But actually, you have to read on, because in this very same sentence, Caesar then says, in all other parts of the daily life, they use Greek letters. So he actually says in that passage that they use Greek letters. He's clearly speaking about Southern Gaul here, that they use Greek letters to write their own language. And that's also what we can see in our documentation. The Gauls or the Celts or Celtic people in more general were basically like everybody else in antiquity in the Mediterranean world. As soon as they had the opportunity to learn writing and to adopt writing, they did it. The only reason why we have so little is that they started to write precisely at the time when they were integrated, or when they were taken over by the Roman Empire. And of course, with the integration, with the incorporation into the Roman Empire, Latin became the standard language of administration, and that is why so little remains. Obviously, we don't have as much documentation of Gaulish as we would like to have, and there's not as much as we know about many other languages. But we have about 600 texts in the Gaulish language. All of them, or most of them, very short. But this is enough for us as historical linguists to get a very clear idea what the structure of the language is, how it relates to other languages, what's going on in the language. And we can at least get a rough idea about the major outlines of the language. It's not enough to write a full grammar, but it's enough for us as historical linguists to get an idea about the language. Oh yeah, absolutely. And well, again, several answers to this. The first one is administration. That is actually the most important function of writing in the entire Mediterranean and antique world. When people start writing, first of all, the most important thing is they start writing for administrative purposes. So, and what you said about the Helvetians and their lists, I mean, that's precisely that fits exactly into that picture. But we also know about the Southern Gauls from around 100 BC. There's a record about them that they were using writing to write letters, and they were writing letters to the people who had died, to the deceased. What they did is they wrote the letters and threw them into the funeral pyre where the dead were burnt, so that the dead could actually read those texts in the afterlife. So this I think also gives a glimpse at that writing was actually used for all kinds of different purposes already in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, and in the centuries after Christ, 1st and 2nd centuries AD, we have loads and loads of documents from all kinds of genres, from all over France, where we see that they're using it for all kinds of everyday purposes. Okay, we have business records, we have funny engravings on pottery, for instance, making jokes to girls, boys making jokes to girls, or drinkers make jokes about their drinking, and obviously a very important kind of text in the first century is also curse tablets. So it's small pieces of lead where they scratch curses, so they maledictions on other people. So that's a very common practice in it's hard to say about the first 2 centuries. When in the first 2 centuries, the situation is quite different from later on. So from the time when before all of Gaul became part of the Roman Empire, the writing is really confined to a very small area in the south, around Marseille, the Rhone Delta. And from that period, what we have mostly is kind of very public, very official, very formulaic text. And it may be the case that at that time, maybe that was more a kind of official thing. But it's very clear to see that as soon as as Gaul is completely incorporated into the Roman Empire, the art of writing, the knowledge about writing, spreads everywhere and to everybody. Okay. Most of the text that we have is clearly from, let's say, kind of normal people. Okay, for instance, we have lists of work processes of potters in La Grave in south of France. We have pottery lists, and there's this famous place in southern France or in central France, La Grave, where in the first century AD there was an enormous center of pottery production. Okay, and that was clearly run. Well, it was probably run by Romans, but the people who worked there were Gauls, and they made everyday work notes in Gaulish, and we have those. Okay, so where they simply recorded, oh, I've created 50 of these pots and 60 of these pots and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's very, very ordinary people who are using it, and there's constantly new finds. So that's one of the exciting things about studying Gaulish or other ancient Celtic languages like Celtiberian or Lepontic, because new texts are constantly being found at archaeological excavations. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of sad because the only thing that remains nowadays is texts that were written on imperishable material, so pottery or lead or metal or stone. And it's quite certain that most of the writing would have been on papyrus or wax tablets, but all of that has of course completely vanished. All right, so it's only the imperishable materials that have survived, but there's constantly coming something. Okay, and every few years there's a new longish text, which is then very exciting because mostly we don't understand them, so we have to spend years and years trying to figure out what this is all about. But that's the joy of the whole work. Well, that's the magic of our historical linguistics. It's actually not so difficult, and it's a kind of triangulation that we're using. Okay. So on the one hand, we can compare those words with words in other languages, like, for instance, Welsh or Irish, and we know how these languages develop over time. Okay, so that gives us one indication what sounds there are in the words. The other one is, of course, simply the writing system. So the writing systems that we have for Gaulish in France, at least, is on the one hand the Greek writing system and the Latin writing system. In northern Italy, we also have writings in Etruscan script. But we know quite well how these languages sounded. I mean, for Latin and Greek, we know quite a lot about how they would have sounded and how to read the text and what the letters actually mean. Okay, and obviously, we then just simply have to make educated inferences, educated guesses about, well, if they write a word like this, they must probably mean that. And so, as I said, we were doing triangulation, and we've basically, I talked about 2 parts of the triangle already, and the third part is language history. We know where the words come from in deep history. We can reconstruct prehistoric languages, and again, we know what the starting point is, and we know where it's going to. And that way we can kind of get a very, I'd say, a fairly good idea about what a word would have sounded like, at least on the level of segments, on the level of sounds. Okay. On the other hand, I mean, there are, of course, natural boundaries, natural limits to what we can understand, what we can know. So, for instance, one difficult question is how to stress Gaulish words. Where is the accent in a Gaulish word? Because that's not something that anybody indicates in the writing. Okay. And we can only make guesses. So a very common guess is that the second last syllable is stressed. And that's, for instance, what I use when I write my Gaulish songs. I use that system. We don't know for sure. I mean, it's a very good educated guess that it is like that, but the pronunciation of Gaulish is probably the easiest of all the things. Understanding it is much more complicated. We're pretty sure that we know very roughly how to pronounce it. And of course, if you do linguistics and if you have a background with phonetics and phonology, that's all very, very straightforward. Well, I mean, simply understanding the words, specifically when we get new texts that, I mean, there are, if we stay, for instance, with Gaulish, I mean, because it's different from language to language. So my chief work is, of course, Old Irish, and the difficulties there are completely different because the attestation is very, very different. Okay, but if we talk about Gaulish, when let's say we find a new text, first of all, simply reading it. That's a very hard part. So all of the texts from the Roman Empire period, they are written in Roman script. Okay, which fundamentally, well, it's basically the same script as we read today, but it looks very different, and it looks very, very weird. Okay, and you have to have a lot of training to actually read it. Secondly, it's really tiny. I mean, you really need to go very close, and you have to have very good eyes to see it. And if it's, for instance, a lead plate with scratchings in them, which has just been taken out of the earth, of course, it's all dirty. So you have to clean it, and you have to make sure that in the process of cleaning, you don't actually make more scratches than there are. So that's the first complicated part. Then you have to hope that they make separations of words. Fortunately, they do it most of the time, so we know what the words are. But for instance, the Romans never separated words. They all wrote in one go without empty spaces in between. If that's the case, that's another difficulty, and so on and so on and on. So there's many hard things there. But it's fun. I mean, that's a nice thing about it. It's cool. Yeah, it's definitely cool. I mean, if you have a thing that is 2,000 years in your hand and I can actually look at it, that's pretty cool. No. I mean, fundamentally, they used in the early period just the Greek alphabet, and later the Roman alphabet, basically the same that we use today. The only thing what they did is they made a few changes to the Roman alphabet, at least in the beginning, because the Roman alphabet is pretty good to write Gaulish, but not perfect. There are a few things in Gaulish phonology, in the Gaulish sounds, that the Roman alphabet can't actually write, and they then used Greek letters in them. But fundamentally, it's the same, like you're using today. Well, first of all, about Savignac. I mean, I've been 25 years in this job, and I've never come across this dictionary by Savignac. And even the French colleagues never cite it. So I'm not sure what it is like. I've never seen it, so I can't say anything. But I think the fact that even the French colleagues never use it probably says something about it. So So we are using, nowadays we're using Xavier de Lamarck's dictionary, which is simply a dictionary of all the attested Gaulish words. So it's a Gaulish French dictionary, not like Savignac French Gaulish. Yeah, it's Gaulish French, and it's simply about attested words. Okay. So the question: can Gaulish be learned like a current language? No, no, it's not possible. We simply know too little about it. Okay. And when people like myself or Savignac or Eluveitie, when we write Gaulish lyrics, for instance, or Gaulish songs, in fact, there's a lot of artificiality in there. So we invent quite a lot of words simply because the words are not attested. In many cases, it's actually not difficult to come up with words, simply because we know what a Celtic language looks like. We can be pretty sure what a certain word would have been in Gaulish. We can reconstruct at least a basic vocabulary with quite some certainty. But I mean, obviously, the finer words, the dialectal words, or so, that's not possible to reconstruct. Okay, and the other thing is the texts that we have are very short. Okay. And they give us only a little bit of insight into the grammar of the language. And there's also a lot of gap in the grammar. So again, when we write our own Gaulish texts, we have to fill in those gaps, for instance, by comparing Gaulish with Old Irish and making inferences from Old Irish to what Gaulish would look like. Okay. But in the end, it's kind of pointless to learn the language as a living language because it's just made up. Okay, it's a fake language. That's it. I mean, that's for instance what I've done. So specifically because we don't have many verbs attested. I mean, actually, the attested Gaulish vocabulary is quite big. There are hundreds and hundreds of words in different ways, either in the inscriptions or maybe as part of names or place names. So that's actually not that bad. But when it comes to verbs, it's much weaker. Okay, we know just a few verbs. Okay, and for instance, what I do in those cases is I take an Old Irish verb, and Old Irish verbs are usually fairly transparent, fairly clear from a Celtic perspective. And I simply transfer that into how it would have looked like if it were Gaulish. And so I then hope that it's not too stupid. So that's more or less, yes. I mean, more or less, insofar as it simply says Eluveitie. So basically, what the band use as their name, and that simply means Helvetian. So it does not mean the Helvetian. It simply means Helvetian. That's all. Okay. Now it's actually quite an interesting thing to, if I may talk a little bit about it, because first of all, the inscription itself is actually Etruscan, as you said. So it's and we can see that it's Etruscan because of the ending "ia." That's a typical Etruscan ending. So if that were Helvetic itself or Gaulish itself, it would actually be Eluveitios with an os at the end. Eluveitios. Okay. So the very fact that he writes Eluveitie, and of course it's written in Etruscan letters, so that you know that for sure, actually shows us that he's making a statement in Etruscan. But obviously, I mean, it looks very much like this is an immigrant into Etruria, an immigrant from wherever Helvetians were at the time, who probably gave up his own name. It's probably not his name, but he calls himself the Helvetian. Okay? Now, the interesting thing, of course, is when we talk about Helvetians today, we think about Switzerland. Now, this inscription is, I think, from 300 BC. That's the normal dating for that, as far as I remember. At that time, as far as we know, the Helvetians didn't actually live in Switzerland, but they lived in Germany, in southern Germany, South Germany. Yeah. So this Helvetian is actually not a Swiss immigrant, but a German immigrant to Now, as you know, I didn't actually write those texts for Eluveitie, but I wrote them for many years earlier for some completely different context, and then I forgot about them. And when a few years later I found that Eluveitie had taken them and had turned them into music, it was a big surprise, and it was very, very interesting experience to have suddenly music to your texts. I wrote 6 or 7 songs altogether, and Eluveitie took 3 of them. So there's one that is very easy to talk about. That's Sierachter. So Sierachter, I wrote that as a very lyrical song. It's a kind of sad song, and I think that actually comes across very, very well in the way what they did with it, and I actually like that very much. And I think their music corresponds quite well to what I meant with the poem. In the case of the others, it's a little bit more complicated. Let's maybe start with Omnos. First of all, Omnos is a title that they gave to that song. The original title is actually connait-on, avec, était, the girl and the wolf. Yeah, that's basically Little Red Riding Hood. So it's really a song about, well, a girl in the forest, and the bad wolf does something bad to her, which is left to the imagination, but you can kind of imagine what he did. And obviously that doesn't come across at all in the song how they perform it. In the way Eluveitie do it, it's just sung by the singer on her own, but originally it was meant as a dialogue. So one stanza by a girl, one stanza by a boy, and all that to the end. And in fact, friends of mine performed it like that, and it was actually quite a nice performance, because the man, the guy who spoke the boy, or who sang the boy, he really enacted it very, very evilly, and he looked like a very evil bad dog. Bad wolf. So I think it could have been a little bit more exciting if they had done that as well. But anyway, they did it. And I'm not quite sure. I mean, obviously, I know what the song is about, so I have my own preconceptions. But what it is for people who do not know what the song is about, it must have a very different atmosphere from what I meant. It's a kind of romantic kind of song, and also the video is very romantic, with the girl running around the mountainside. So it has nothing. It really has nothing to do with what the song was about originally. and the other one is, of course, Slania's song, which even though I must admit that Eluveitie is not my kind of music. I listen to other types of music, but I do actually like Slania's song. It's a very forceful song, and it's a very good tune. But I think they completely misunderstood that song. Because when I wrote it as a very deliberate parody, a persiflage of national anthems. So I used every kind of cliche I could find about national anthems. I even quoted the Irish national anthem, I quoted the Welsh national anthem, and quoted various regional anthems, for instance, from my home Austria, and just took the worst parts of everything and put it into one text, and made it a very bloody, very, very, very. When I first heard it, I was very much surprised.
I guess.
But then I realized, after listening to it a couple of times, I realized that if you don't understand the parody, it actually makes sense as a seriously meant song. And obviously, what I found very funny later on when I Googled in the internet, that some people suggested, oh yeah, that should be made the Swiss national anthem. I thought, well, that would be cool, but they completely missed my original intent. Well, what was also interesting for me as the poet of this poem was that it was a very live illustration of the concept of the open art, the open piece of art. Because I had my interpretation of that song, I had never thought that anybody could take it seriously. But then I saw that, well, they actually take it seriously, and
Yes.
hundreds of thousands of people take it seriously. So in a sense, this poem has moved out from my own reach and has taken on a life completely of its own, which
Yes.
is interesting experience. There's one line in Slania's song, or originally called Norea's, the national anthem of Norea. There's one line which I'm really, really proud of, and this is this line, "Blatu blande bitos biwam." I use a lot of poetical techniques like rhyme or a lot of alliteration. So if you look at my lyrics, you see that there's loads and loads of alliteration in there. So there's a lot of poetical technique that actually goes into my text. And this line, "Blatu blande bitos biwam," is I mean, first of all, it's rhythmical. "Blatu blande bitos biwam." It's iambic. And it's all alliterated with B. It's also bl bl b b. So it's
Yes, it's very very well done.
Yeah. Well, I'm very proud of it. But I think that line actually comes across very good, very well in the song. I mean, that's very, very prominent in the song. So I actually had a look at them, and in fact I must say that they are quite good. So I can certainly see where they're coming from and what they're doing. In a sense, they are. I mean, I looked at what information the Genius website gave me, so it seems to have been written by various people, but all of them are. I mean, you can see that they know what they're doing. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Obviously, I might disagree with certain forms, but these are really detail points. It's not, but fundamentally, you can see where they're coming from, and you can see that they're basically doing similar things like I did. So maybe they took my song as a model for that. So you can see how they took, for instance, Old Irish verbs and converted them into Gaulish verbs. Sometimes what they're doing is they're using actually attested Gaulish phrases, because sometimes we have suitable things really in actual written text, and they're using them and putting them into a text. So yeah, so it makes sense, and clearly, I mean, all of those gods that they sing about in that album, they are well-known Gaulish gods. I mean, we know that these were gods. So
Okay.
That's all well researched. So I certainly can't say anything bad about it. So it's
Okay.
I would do certain things differently, but fundamentally it's not bad. Okay? Sorry, no, it's quite obviously clear that whoever wrote these songs, that they did study Celtic languages and Indo-European languages.
Okay, thank you very much.
Eh bien voilà. J'espère que vous avez apprécié. Moi j'ai trouvé ça vraiment cool. Encore merci à David Stifter pour le temps qu'il m'a accordé. Je vous mets le lien de son compte Twitter en description. Sur ce, je vous fais des bisous et à très vite.